https://www.fanmemspace.com/tin-tuck/fake IP-trying The cold came early to Ridgefield that year. By the second week of October, the leaves along Route 9 had already turned deep amber and rust, in a brown so dark it looked almost black in the early morning light. The sycamores that lined the road dropped their bark in pale strips, leaving the trunks ghostly white against the gray Virginia sky. The Coldwater River ran high and fast beneath the old Route 9 bridge, fed by 3 weeks of rain that had soaked the hills and turned the creek beds into rivers and the rivers into something wilder. Beckett Calloway knew the sound of that river better than he knew almost anything else. He knew the way it muttered low and steady on calm nights, a sound almost like breathing. He knew the way it roared after rain, the way the current changed pitch depending on how swollen it had become. He knew the smell of it, that cold mineral living smell that seeped into everything under the bridge, into his sleeping bag, into his clothes, into his hair, even after he washed it in the school bathroom sink every morning before first period. He had been sleeping under the Route 9 bridge for 8 months. He did not think of it as home. He thought of it as the current situation. He was careful about language like that, about the stories he told himself, because he had learned early that the stories you told yourself were the ones you ended up living inside. He was not a homeless kid. He was a kid in a temporary situation who happened to sleep under a bridge. The distinction mattered. The tarp was blue military surplus bought with money he had earned washing windows at the Sunoco station on Millbrook Road. He had stretched it between 2 concrete support pillars using a rope he had found behind the hardware store. A good thick rope, the kind that did not give even when the wind came hard off the river. Beneath the tarp, a sleeping bag with a busted zipper he had fixed with a safety pin, a wool blanket someone from the First Methodist food pantry had pressed into his hands last March, and a cardboard box that served as both dresser and desk. The box held everything he owned: a change of clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, 2 pairs of socks folded with a precision that would have impressed a soldier. A toothbrush in a travel-sized tube of toothpaste replaced every month. A library copy of Invisible Man he had renewed 4 times because he kept starting it over. A photograph he no longer looked at face down at the bottom of the box of a woman and a small boy standing in front of a house that no longer existed, with a sky that had been very blue. And his school notebooks, 6 of them spiral-bound, one for each subject, each page covered in his small, careful handwriting. He was 17 years old and he had a 3.8 GPA. Most mornings, Beckett was up before dawn. Not because he set an alarm. His phone had died in April and he had never replaced it, but because the cold woke him. There was a particular hour somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning when the temperature dropped its last few degrees and the chill moved from uncomfortable to something with intent. Something that wanted in. He had learned to wake at that hour, pull the wool blanket tighter, breathe slow and deliberate until the shaking stopped and his body generated enough heat to push the cold back. Then he would lie still and think about the day ahead. The thinking was important. He had learned this from a man named Harold, who had lived under this same bridge for 2 years before the city finally got him into transitional housing. Harold was 64 years old, a Korean War veteran's son who had fallen through every crack the system had to offer. But Harold had taught Beckett one thing before he left structure: was survival. Not a shelter roof over your head, not a full stomach. Structure. A reason to get up, a place to be, something to do next. Every morning Beckett thought through his day in sequence. Walk to school, wash up in the gym bathroom. First period chemistry, second period English, third period calculus. Lunch, eat slowly, taste it, do not wolf it down like it might disappear. Afternoon classes, library from 3 to 5 where he helped 2 freshman students, Marcus and a girl named Addie, with their algebra homework. Then the walk back. Stop at the food pantry on Wednesdays. Check on the tarp. Read until the light was gone. He varied nothing. Variation was a luxury. The walk to Ridgefield High was 3 miles. He had worn his sneakers through to the point where he could feel the grain of the pavement through the right sole, and the left shoe had developed a flap at the toe that slapped the ground when he walked if he did not plant his foot at a precise angle. He had fixed it twice with duct tape from the hardware store, and twice the tape had given way. The third time he decided not to fix it and instead learned the angle. Ridgefield High was a big school, 1,200 students, spread across 4 floors of a brick building that had been added onto so many times over the decades that it looked like an architectural argument with itself. The gym was in the oldest part, a 1960s addition with green tile floors and lockers that shrieked when you opened them. Beckett arrived every morning 15 minutes before the first bell, slipping through the side entrance near the parking lot, while the lot was still mostly empty. He knew which teachers arrived early and which arrived late. He knew which janitors cleaned, which hallways, and what time they finished. He knew the exact schedule of morning activity in the gym building, and he had arranged his routine around it with the precision of someone who understood that invisibility was a skill requiring constant maintenance. In the gym bathroom, he kept a small Ziploc bag tucked behind the radiator pipe in the second stall. Inside, a stick of deodorant, a small bottle of unscented lotion for the dry skin on his hands, a comb, and a bar of soap. Every morning, he washed his face and neck, combed his hair, applied the deodorant, and changed from his sleeping clothes a second pair of sweatpants and an old thermal shirt he used only at night into his school clothes. His school clothes were clean. He washed them every Sunday at the laundromat on Cedar Street, where the attendant, a heavy-set woman named Donna, had once caught him counting quarters short and simply waved him through without a word. He had never forgotten that. By the time first period started, Beckett Calloway looked like any other junior at Ridgefield High. A little thin, maybe. The circles under his eyes were dark enough that a perceptive person might notice them. But his clothes were clean and his hair was combed, and when teachers called on him, he answered with a clarity and precision that made most of them assume he came from a stable home with bookshelves and a mother who asked about his homework. He had learned to wear that assumption like a second skin. The teachers who suspected something, and there were 2, maybe 3, who seemed to notice more than the others, had the decency not to ask directly. His chemistry teacher, Mr. Aldridge, had once left a brown bag lunch on Beckett's desk without comment and never mentioned it again. His English teacher, Ms. Hartwell, had a quiet way of pairing Beckett with the kids who needed tutoring, framing it as a favor she was asking of him, never as charity. He appreciated that. He appreciated it more than he would ever be able to say. What he could not appreciate, could not make peace with, no matter how carefully he managed his thinking, was the cold. The cold was different from hunger. Hunger was a manageable presence. You could distract yourself from hunger, negotiate with it, redirect your mind somewhere else. The cold would not be redirected. It occupied every square inch of your attention. It was the most honest thing in his life. It never pretended to be anything other than what it was, never offered comfort or qualification. When the temperature dropped below 30, his hands stopped working properly before he even reached the river. He had started wearing his spare pair of socks on his hands at night. October was the tipping point. October was when the current situation began to require a different kind of planning. He had spent the last 2 weeks thinking carefully about winter, about what was possible and what was not. The sleeping bag, even with the wool blanket layered over it, had limits. He knew those limits. He had found them last January before he had acquired the blanket when he woke up one night to find he could not feel his feet and spent an hour by the river thinking about whether his feet were going to be all right before feelings started to come back. He had solutions. He was always working towards solutions. The First Methodist Food Pantry ran a coat drive every November and handed out sleeping bags to people on the street. There was a drop-in center on Archer Street that allowed overnight stays when the temperature dropped below 20 degrees. He had a plan. What he did not have was the ability to entirely silence the part of himself that was 17 years old and exhausted and cold and wanted more than anything, something as simple and unattainable as warmth. He kept that part very quiet. On the 3rd Saturday in October, Beckett sat on the riverbank a quarter-mile downstream from the Route 9 bridge, his back against a fallen oak, his chemistry textbook open in his lap. The afternoon sun was making a weak effort through a gap in the clouds, and the light it cast was thin and golden and did almost nothing against the bite in the air. He had his flannel shirt buttoned to the top and his hands tucked into his sleeves between notes. The Coldwater River ran fast here, the current pushing hard against a curve in the bank that created a deep pool before the water straightened out again toward the old mill. The banks were steep, the soil undercut by years of high water, the tree roots exposed in tangled fingers above the waterline. Upstream, the old Hargrove Mill Bridge arched across the river, a 19th century stone structure, narrow and low with a rusted iron railing that the county had been threatening to replace for years. It was a beautiful spot in the way that places get beautiful when you have spent enough time in them to know all their moods. Beckett was working through a problem set on equilibrium constants when he heard the laughter. High and careless the way laughter sounds when it belongs to people who have never needed to be quiet. He looked upstream. Three girls stood on the Hargrove Mill Bridge maybe 50 yards away, leaning over the railing with their phones out. They were taking photos of the river, turning to take photos of each other, utterly absorbed in the performance of the afternoon. Beckett watched them for a moment. He was not unfamiliar with that kind of afternoon, the kind where you had nowhere particular to be, and the light was doing something interesting, and the world felt temporarily generous. He had not had an afternoon like that in some time. He did not begrudge them theirs. He turned back to his textbook. The scream reached him before he looked up. Not a startled sound, not the shriek of girls performing alarm for each other. A real scream, the kind that comes from the body before the mind has time to shape it, the kind that cuts through ambient noise and does something biological to the person who hears it. Beckett was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. He looked upstream. One of the girls was gone from the bridge. For one fractured second, he saw only two figures at the railing, their hands pressed over their mouths, their bodies rigid. Then he saw the water, a flash of color, a yellow jacket there and then under. The river at the mill bridge was deep and fast. The recent rain had pushed it to the top of its banks. The current here did not forgive inattention. Beckett was already running. He dropped the textbook on the bank without thinking. He pulled off his sneakers, both of them, not just one, because he understood even in that fractured state of moving before thinking that he needed his feet to work, and he went into the river. The cold hit him with the force of a physical blow. Not cold the way October air is cold, or cold the way a concrete floor is cold at 4 in the morning. A total encompassing cold that drove the air from his lungs and compressed his chest like a fist closing. The current took him immediately, spinning him sideways before he could establish any purchase with his feet, and for 3 full seconds he was simply in the water, and the water had him. Then instinct reasserted. He had been on swim team at Millbrook Middle School briefly before everything fell apart. He remembered the mechanics, if not the confidence arms, pulling head up, breathe on the pull kick from the hip. He got his body oriented against the current and started swimming upstream hard toward where he had seen the girl go under. His clothes were already saturated and pulling down with a weight that surprised him. Jeans, especially denim, fills with water and becomes something close to concrete. He had not thought to take them off, and there was no time now. He kicked harder and pulled harder, and the cold moved from shock into something almost meditative. A total clarity. Every non-essential thought stripped away, nothing left but the task directly in front of him. He scanned the water. The current had moved her from where she had gone under. He looked downstream, looked for anything, color, movement, disturbance in the surface. There, 10 yards ahead and slightly to his right, a hand breaking the surface. Not waving, just rising involuntary, the body doing what the body does. Beckett changed direction and swam. He reached her as she was going under again. He got his hand into her jacket, a yellow quilted jacket, expensive, soaked through and heavy, and hauled upward. She came up fighting. He had expected that. Drowning people always fight because the body does not understand that the person trying to hold them is trying to help. She clawed at his arm, and her elbow connected with his ribs hard enough to drive the breath out of him, and water got into his mouth, and he swallowed some before he could stop it. He held on. He wrapped his arm across her chest from behind, pinning her arms the way he vaguely remembered from some safety card in some waiting room somewhere. She struggled for another few seconds, desperate, terrified, her body operating on pure animal panic, and then something shifted and she went still. Not unconscious, just still. Like she had decided, some part of her had decided to trust the arm across her chest. He kicked for the bank. The current was against him. He had misjudged how far upstream he had gotten in his approach, and now the river was trying to push them both further downstream, away from the shallower water near the mill bridge. His legs were beginning to lose their precision, the cold working into the muscles, making them slow and imprecise. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel around the patch of mud and grass he was kicking toward. He did not think about anything except the bank. The girl in his arms said something he could not hear over the water. He kept kicking. His foot scraped bottom there, 6 inches of rocky riverbed, then gravel, then mud. He found his footing and stood both of them and hauled them the last 10 feet through water that went from waist deep to knee deep to ankle deep. And then they were on the bank and he was on his knees in the mud and the girl was coughing beside him, her whole body shaking with it, coughing up river water in long convulsive heaves. Beckett knelt in the mud and breathed. His hands were shaking. The cold had gotten deep into his chest and his teeth were knocking against each other with a sound he could feel more than hear. But the girl was coughing. Coughing meant breathing. Coughing him meant alive, and the shaking in his hands gradually resolved into something that was not quite steady, but was no longer completely uncontrolled. He looked at her. She was maybe 14, maybe 15. Blonde hair plastered across her face, mascara running in dark tracks down her cheeks. She was wearing the yellow quilted jacket and dark jeans and boots that had probably cost more than everything in Beckett's cardboard box combined. She looked like someone who came from a particular kind of life, not flashy exactly, but solid. The kind of solid that does not announce itself because it does not need to. She was also looking at him between the coughs with an expression he recognized. The expression of someone who has just been very close to something enormous and final and does not yet have the language for what that means. "Are you hurt?" he managed. His voice came out rougher than he intended, his throat raw from the water. She shook her head, kept shaking. He was not sure if she was answering him or just shaking. "I can't swim," she said. The words came out between coughs. I told them I can't swim." Her friends arrived at a run from the bridge path, their faces gone the color of old paper. One of them was already on the phone, her voice high and frightened as she gave an address to someone Beckett hoped was a dispatcher. The other simply stood at the edge of the bank and stared at the girl on the ground with an expression that was either shock or the beginning of understanding what almost happened. Beckett stood up. He was soaked through and shaking with a cold that went beyond temperature into something structural, something that had gotten into the joints of him. He looked at the girl on the bank. She was sitting up now, more color coming back into her face, her friends crouching around her, and he calculated the time until the ambulance arrived and the questions that would follow and the trajectory of those questions. He had learned to think about trajectories. An ambulance meant paramedics meant questions. Where are your parents? Can we call someone? Do you have ID? He had answers to all of those questions, but the answers led to further questions, and the further questions led to conversations he was not prepared to have on a Saturday afternoon on a muddy riverbank while he was soaking wet and shaking. He had school on Monday. He had a test on Tuesday. He had things to do. He was looking around for his sneakers when he heard the car. A black SUV moving fast on the service road above the bank, stopping hard in the gravel. The door opened before the engine was fully off. A woman came down the bank path at something close to a run, not quite running, but moving with the compressed urgency of someone who is running on the inside. She was in her mid-40s. Blonde hair pulled back, same shade as the girl's, a few strands coming loose. She was wearing faded jeans and a leather vest over a plain gray t-shirt, and there was something in the way she moved, the economy of it, the precision that made Beckett think of people who had trained themselves not to waste motion. Not an athlete's movement, something harder earned than that. She reached her daughter and dropped to her knees in the mud without any apparent concern for her jeans. She held the girl with both arms and did not say anything for a long moment, just held her. The girl, her daughter, pressed her face into the woman's shoulder and the shaking began to ease. Then the woman looked up. She looked directly at Beckett and took him in with an attention that did not look past him or through him, but directly at him without flinching. She was reading a situation. He could feel it, the thoroughness of it, and he knew what she was seeing. Soaked jeans, wet flannel, clinging to a frame that was too thin, no shoes, dark circles, the whole picture. He knew how to read that kind of assessment. He had been assessed like that before, usually by social workers and school counselors, and the occasional well-meaning stranger. He waited for the familiar sequence, the recognition, the concern, the carefully worded questions. "You saved my daughter." Her voice was low and even, not a question. Beckett shrugged. The shrug was habit, a deflection so ingrained it activated before thought. Anyone would have. She shook her head, a single small motion. "But you did." She stood up from the mud in one clean movement and extended her hand. She did not seem to notice or did not care that her knees were dark with riverbank mud. "I'm Marlo. What's your name, Beckett?" She repeated it the way people repeat a name when they are storing it somewhere specific. Not reflexively, deliberately. Becketed. Then she looked at him again, the second look, the longer one, and something shifted behind her eyes. Not pity. He knew pity, and this was not it. Something more precise than that, something that looked almost like recognition, like she was reading a situation she had read before and had not forgotten. Where are your parents? We need to thank them. Beckett felt the familiar closing down, the practiced neutrality settling over his face like a visor. I'm on my own. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. He did not look away. Then she opened her mouth to say something he never learned what it was going to be, because the sirens arrived and the paramedics came down the bank path with their bags and their questions, and the scene dissolved into the organized chaos of aftermath. The paramedics wrapped him in a foil blanket and asked him questions about how long he had been in the water, and whether he had swallowed any, and whether he felt dizzy. And while they were asking him questions, he was watching Marlo stand at the edge of the scene with her arm around her daughter, talking quietly with the paramedics. And he registered the way even the paramedics angled slightly toward her, the way people do around someone whose authority is not a performance, but a fact. He had answered all the questions. He had been cleared. He was fine. He looked once more for his sneakers, found them where he had dropped them in the grass, and put them back on. His feet were numb enough that he could not feel the split sole of the left one. He picked up his chemistry textbook from the bank, the pages fanned open and damp at the edges, and he tucked it under his arm. He said to no one in particular, "I'm glad she's okay." Then he turned and walked away. He made the 3 miles back to the bridge in wet clothes, the late afternoon sun doing nothing useful. By the time he reached the overpass, the cold had moved into his bones in a way that felt like it had taken up residence. He hung his clothes on the rope line between the pillars and got into the sleeping bag in his thermal layer and pulled the wool blanket over the top and lay there shaking for the better part of an hour before his body temperature climbed back to something workable. He did not think about the woman named Marlo or what she had seen when she looked at him. He opened his chemistry textbook to the damp pages and picked up where he had left off. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of the usual architecture of his days, which he maintained with the care of someone who understood that the days themselves were the thing, not the circumstances around them, but the shape and sequence of each hour. School, library, food pantry on Wednesdays. Work on Saturday at the Sunoco station, where the owner, a taciturn man named Gary, who had never asked a single personal question in the 6 months Beckett had been washing his windows, paid him $40 cash, and sometimes left a gas station sandwich on the counter near the register without comment. He avoided the Coldwater River, not deliberately, not with any formal intention. But when his routes took him near it, he found reasons to take different streets, and when the sound of it reached him from a distance, he felt something tight and cold in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. The second Saturday in November was gray from the start, low clouds sitting on the hills west of Ridgefield, like they had decided to stay a while. Beckett woke at the usual hour and lay in the dark thinking through his day and noticed that the thinking felt harder than usual. The cold was deeper than it had been. The forecast he checked forecasts at the library had said low 30s overnight, and he believed it. He was going to need to rethink the winter plan. The sleeping bag was at the edge of its effective range. He needed either a better bag or a supplemental heat source, or to stop being someone who slept outside. The drop-in center on Archer Street had beds available below 20 degrees, but the Archer Street staff required ID and asked questions in a way that meant something to someone he had never been sure what, and the shelter on Broad Street had a waiting list and required a caseworker referral. He was working through this problem methodically without urgency, the way he worked through all problems when the sound reached him. He thought at first it was thunder, low and continuous coming from the east, a vibration he felt in the concrete pillar through his shoulder before he heard it distinctly. Then it resolved. Not thunder, engines. He pushed back the tarp and stood up. The access road that curved under the Route 9 bridge from the east was visible from his shelter in a straight line of about 200 yards. In the gray morning light, he could see something moving on that road. Something long and bright with chrome moving slowly, a line of headlights that seemed to have no end. Motorcycles. He counted 10 before he stopped counting. Then 20. Then he stopped trying to count it all and simply stood and watched as they came one after another, the sound building from a rumble into something that filled the underpass and resonated in his sternum. They filled the access road and then the wide concrete apron under the bridge, and then the road itself, parking in careful rows like they had done this before, like the arrangement had been considered in advance. Not 10, not 20. The number that eventually settled under that bridge was somewhere in the vicinity of 200. Beckett's back found the concrete pillar. His body made that decision before his mind was fully engaged with what he was seeing. He stood with the cold concrete against his spine and watched men and women in leather vests dismount their motorcycles with the unhurried efficiency of people who had been riding for a long time. Some of them were enormous. Some of them were not. All of them wore the same vest, black leather, with a patch on the back he could not make out at this distance. And all of them had the same quality of stillness. When they stopped moving, a stillness that did not mean inactive. There was nowhere to run, and he understood that running was not what was called for, but his body had not entirely caught up with his understanding. Then the crowd shifted. A lane opened through the middle, the rider stepping aside with a choreography that spoke of long practice. And through that lane walked a woman, Marlo. She was wearing the same leather vest she had worn at the river, or one exactly like it. Her hair was down today, falling past her shoulders. She walked through 200 bikers with the same economy of motion he had seen on the riverbank. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. She stopped 15 feet away from him and looked at him with that particular quality of attention he had not forgotten, and he felt seen in a way that was not entirely comfortable. Behind her, a man stepped forward, 6'5" or thereabouts, with a gray beard that started at his cheekbones and reached his chest, in a presence that changed the atmospheric pressure of the space around him. He moved like someone who had learned a long time ago that his bodice said enough without his voice adding to it, and when he finally chose to speak, the voice was low and unhurried and carried across the entire concrete apron without effort. Beckett Calloway. Not a question. A statement. Like reading a name off a register. Beckett kept his back against the pillar. Yeah. The man looked at him steadily. Name's Harlan. I'm president of this chapter. He let the words land and settle. This is my family. Behind him, 200 people stood without moving in the gray November morning. Marlo took one step forward. Her voice was quieter than Harlan's, but somehow no less present. You saved my daughter. She did not look away from his face. 3 weeks ago, you went into that river without thinking twice. Beckett said nothing. She reached into her vest and removed a folded piece of paper. She did not open it yet. Before I show you this, I want to tell you something. She paused. I have spent 3 weeks asking questions about you. I want you to know that. I want you to know that I know who you are. He felt something move through his chest, not fear exactly. Something closer to the feeling of being picked up and turned over in someone's hands. You are 17 years old, she said. You have been sleeping under this bridge since February. You have a 3.8 GPA. You help other students with their work in the library. You have been to 4 foster families, and the last one left you here and moved to Ohio without telling anyone. Beckett's jaw was tight. He said nothing. Marlo's voice remained even. You have not once asked for help. Not from your school, not from the city, not from anyone. She looked at him for a moment. That is either the most impressive thing I have ever heard or the saddest, and I think it might be both. Harlan stepped forward then, and the paper in Marlo's hand turned out to be a document Harlan was now holding unfolded, reading from, in a voice that carried the same flat authority as everything else about him. 2 weeks ago, I called in every favor I had in this county and a few I had in the next one. He read, found you a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on Fairlane Street, owned by a member of this club. The owner has agreed to waive rent until you turn 18 and can sign your own lease. After that, you pay what you can while you are in school. He looked up. That is not charity. That is a fair deal between people who respect each other. Beckett could not speak. Something had happened to his throat. Marlo was watching him carefully. I also spoke with Vera Dunn. She gestured to a woman at the edge of the lane, silver-haired, solid, with the particular calm of someone who had seen a great deal and remained standing afterward. Vera spent 20 years as a child welfare caseworker. She has been retired for 3 years. She has agreed to help us navigate the paperwork. Your situation has some legal complications that need addressing, and Vera knows how to address them. From somewhere in the crowd, a man stepped forward, late 50s, reading glasses pushed up on his head. I'm Warren Fisk. I'm an attorney. There are some things in your history that require legal attention. We will talk about that later when you are ready. Another man, younger, mid-20s, broad shoulders, easy grin that seems somehow genuine given the circumstances. Colt Raleigh, construction crew. I can use a weekend worker if you want the work. 15 an hour schedule works around school. He shrugged. Offer stands. Beckett looked from face to face. He counted them. He could not stop himself. It was the kind of thing his mind did, counting and cataloging when the world exceeded his ability to process it whole. Marlowe, Harlan, Vera, Warren, Colt, and behind them 200 people standing quietly in the gray morning light, their breath visible in small clouds, watching him with expressions that ranged from solemn to something that looked like it might be hope. He thought about the boy who had learned to be invisible, the boy who had learned that needs were vulnerabilities and vulnerabilities were liabilities, and that the only safe position was to want nothing that anyone could take away. He had spent 8 months perfecting that position, 8 months of structure and invisibility, and the constant, careful maintenance of a life held together with duct tape and precision. He looked at Marlowe. She was not offering him pity. He was certain of that now, as certain as he was of anything. She was offering him something that had been evaluated and decided upon by 200 people, who had dropped whatever they were doing on a Saturday morning to drive to a highway overpass and stand in the cold. "What is this?" he finally said. His voice was not steady. Marlowe did not hesitate. "This is what you do when someone jumps in the water." She held his gaze. "You jump in after them." Behind her, Harlan made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was something adjacent to warmth. 200 people breathed out into the November air. Beckett Calloway stood with his back against a concrete pillar under Route 9 bridge with everything he owned in a cardboard box 6 feet away, and felt for the first time in 8 months the particular and unmistakable sensation of something giving way. Not collapsing, giving way, the way a door gives way when someone finally opens it from the other side. They moved him that same afternoon. Beckett had expected the process to take days, the paperwork, the arrangements, the careful bureaucratic architecture of transferring a person from one situation to another. He had experience with that architecture. He knew its hallways and its waiting rooms and its particular brand of fluorescent-lit uncertainty. He had spent the better part of his life inside it. What happened instead was that Colt Raleigh handed him a set of keys and said simply, "Third floor, number 304. The elevator works on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Use the stairs the rest of the time." Then Vera Dunn produced a folder of paperwork 3 inches thick and said she would need 2 hours of his time on Monday to begin working through it. And Warren Fisk gave him a business card and said, "Call when you are ready, no rush, but do not wait too long." And then with a choreography as organized as their arrival, 200 motorcycles departed from beneath the Route 9 bridge, leaving behind a silence that felt enormous. Marlowe was the last to leave. She stood at the edge of the concrete apron while the final bikes moved out to the access road, and she looked at Beckett with that same quality of assessment he had first noticed on the riverbank. Then she said, "My daughter wants to come by tomorrow. I told her to give you a day." Beckett said she does not have to. Marlowe said she knows that. That is why she wants to. Then she put on her helmet, swung onto her motorcycle, a dark red Harley Softail that looked like it had been maintained with professional devotion, and rode out of the underpass without looking back. Beckett stood alone for a moment in the place where he had spent 8 months and looked at what remained in the blue tarp, the rope line, the sleeping bag and blanket, the cardboard box, the accumulated material of a life held very carefully together. He folded everything with the same precision he had always used. The clothes, the blanket, the photograph face down tucked between 2 folded shirts. He loaded it all into a single duffel bag that Colt had left behind without comment, a large canvas bag with reinforced handles, the kind built for actual weight, and picked it up and walked out of the underpass without looking back. The apartment at 304 Fairlane Street was on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse building 4 blocks from the center of Ridgefield. The building had been brick since 1887, and someone had spent considerable money and care on the conversion-exposed beams, original windows with their wavy glass, still intact hardwood floors that creaked in specific places. The studio was small, 1 main room, a kitchen alcove, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that had been retrofitted with a shower. But it was warm. That was the thing that undid him briefly privately in the first minutes alone in that apartment. The radiator against the east wall was putting out steady heat, and when Beckett stood in the middle of the room and let that heat reach him, something happened in his chest that he was not prepared for. Not relief exactly, something older than relief, something the body remembers before the mind does. He stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he unpacked his bag, arranged his clothes in the small closet, placed his notebooks on the table near the window, and put the photograph still face down in the drawer of the bedside table. He did not look at it. He sat on the edge of the bed, a real mattress, a bed frame, two pillows, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Outside, the gray November afternoon was darkening toward evening. The sounds of the street came up through the old windows, a car, voices a dog somewhere. The ordinary, unremarkable sound of a city living at Saturday. He tried to feel something clean and simple about what had happened. Gratitude, maybe the pure, uncomplicated kind. But it kept arriving mixed with other things, a wariness he could not entirely suppress, the trained skepticism of someone who had learned that generosity sometimes came with architecture of its own obligations and expectations built into the foundation that only became visible later. He had not asked for this. He had not known to want it. He was not sure yet how to hold it. Sunday arrived with pale winter light and the smell of coffee from the apartment below. Sadie Voss knocked on his door at 10:30. She was wearing a green jacket today, not yellow, and her hair was in a braid that had come partially loose. She looked different than she had on the riverbank. The shock was gone from her face, replaced by something more complex, an expression he could not immediately categorize. She held out a chemistry textbook, still in the plastic wrap. "My old one got ruined," he said. "I know." She extended it further. "I talked to my teacher. She said she would tutor you if you need it. She is really good." He took the book, looked at it. "You did not have to." She shrugged with one shoulder in a way that reminded him unexpectedly of Marlowe. The same economy, the same refusal to perform more than what was necessary. "You went into a river for me," she said. "A chemistry book is not a very impressive response to that, but it is what I have got." He almost smiled. She stayed for 40 minutes. They sat at his table by the window, and she told him about Ridgefield East, the school she attended, and a history project she was working on about westward expansion, and a teacher she found alternately brilliant and unbearable. He told her about the equilibrium constant problem, said he had been working on when she fell off the bridge, and she laughed a real laugh, unguarded, and said that was the most specific detail anyone had ever told her about saving someone's life. When she left, she paused in the doorway. "My mom," she said, then seemed to reconsider. "Nothing, just she is hard to read sometimes. She means what she does more than what she says." Beckett nodded. He understood that kind of person. He spent the rest of Sunday reading the chemistry textbook she had brought. On the inside cover in careful handwriting, she had written, "You jumped in when it mattered. Now we are jumping in for you, the family." He read the inscription 3 times. Then he set the book down and looked out the window at the street below for a long time. Monday morning, he met with Vera Dunn in the community room on the ground floor of his building. Vera Dunn was 63 years old and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where stillness was a professional requirement. She had silver hair cut practically short and reading glasses on a cord around her neck and a canvas bag from which she produced documents with the efficiency of long practice. She laid out his situation clearly and without softening it in the way that people sometimes soften things for him, which he appreciated. "Your foster care case was closed administratively when the Pruitt family filed a change of address notification in Ohio," she said. "They listed you as relocated with the family. That was a false filing. You were not relocated. You were abandoned." She looked at him over her glasses. "That distinction matters legally." "What does it mean?" he asked. "It means several things." She turned a page. "First, you are entitled to continued foster care support payments until you are 21 under Virginia law. Those payments were illegally diverted. Second, your emancipation can be expedited given your circumstances. Warren is already working on that. Third," she paused. "The Pruitt family continued receiving monthly support payments from the state for 6 months after they filed that notification. While you were sleeping under a bridge, someone was cashing checks in your name." Beckett looked at the table. "I know that is a lot to take in," Vera said. How much, he asked. His voice was level. The monthly amount for a child your age in Virginia is approximately $800. Over 6 months, that is approximately $4,800, plus the initial relocation allowance they filed for. She folded her hands on the table. You have options. Warren can pursue a civil claim. He can also work with the county to refer the case to the state attorney's office for fraud charges. Or you can let it go and focus forward. She paused. There is no wrong choice. I will think about it, he said. That is exactly the right answer. He left the meeting with 4 documents to review, and a follow-up scheduled for Wednesday, and the first faint outline of something he recognized distantly as the sensation of having a future that extended beyond the next season. His first Saturday with Colt Raleigh's construction crew was 3 weeks after he moved into the apartment. The work site was a commercial renovation in the warehouse district south of downtown, a former textile building being converted into office space. Beckett arrived at 6:30 in the morning to find the crew already assembled, 7 men ranging in age from Colt's 26 to a man named Boyd, who was somewhere north of 60 and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had been doing physical work for decades and had learned to make peace with it. Colt handed him a hard hat, a pair of work gloves, and a set of instructions that were clear and specific and assumed a baseline of intelligence without being condescending. You will be with me and Boyd today, he said. Hauling, measuring, some basic cutting. Pay attention, ask questions when you have them. Do not pretend to understand something you do not. He paused. And wear the gloves. Boyd lost the tip of a finger on a job site, and he has been evangelical about gloves ever since. Boyd, who was standing 6 feet away and had clearly heard this said without turning around, evangelical is not an exaggeration. The work was hard in a way that was entirely different from the cold and invisible labor of surviving. It was physical and immediate and had visible results. At the end of the day, a wall that had not been there in the morning existed plumb and solid. There was a satisfaction in that he had not anticipated. The crew treated him without ceremony, which was precisely what he needed. No acknowledgement of his situation, no visible awareness that he was anything other than a Saturday worker who needed the money and was willing to do the work. At the end of the day, Colt pressed $200 into his hand. You earned it, Colt said. Same time next week. On the walk home, Beckett stopped at the grocery store on Lincoln Street, a real grocery store, not the food pantry, and bought eggs and bread and a can of soup and a bar of dark chocolate, and the transaction felt like something. He was not sure exactly what. Something between ordinary and profound. It was at school, 2 weeks into December, that he first became aware of the problem. He was eating lunch in the cafeteria when Sadie found the table. She went to a different school, but she had come by with a question about the history project, which had evolved into an ongoing conversation that had nothing to do with history, and as she sat down, 3 tables away, he saw 2 boys watching. Not the ordinary peripheral awareness of a cafeteria. Something pointed. One of them said something to the other. Beckett could not hear it, but he saw the other one's face and he recognized the expression. It happened in increments over the following week. Whispered things in hallways. A look from a guidance counselor that lasted slightly too long. A comment from a junior he barely knew, said too casually to be accidental, about some people getting handed things they did not earn. He did not understand the source of it yet. He only understood the feeling of it, the same feeling he had had under the bridge when the cold moved from uncomfortable to intentional. Something with direction. Something aimed. He said nothing. He observed. Marlo came by the apartment on the second Thursday in December. He had not seen her since the morning at the bridge. She knocked without announcement. He opened the door to find her in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee from the place on Millbrook Road and an expression that suggested she had thought about whether to come and decided to come, but was not going to make a production of the decision. She held out one of the cups. He stepped back and let her in. She looked around the apartment with the careful attention of someone assessing something they have a stake in. Her eyes moved to the chemistry textbook on the table, the notebook stacked beside it. The jacket hung neatly on the hook by the door. She sat at the table. He sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. This did not seem to trouble her. How are you doing? She asked finally. He gave the question its due consideration rather than deflecting it. Better, he said, still adjusting. That is honest. He looked at his coffee. Can I ask you something? She waited. Why? He said. Not the bridge, not that day. He met her eyes. Why all of it? The apartment, the crew, Warren, Vera. Why does any of this happen? Marlo held the cup in both hands and looked at him steadily. Because Rex would have done it, she said. The name carried weight. He could hear it. And because some things are worth doing, not because they are easy or logical, but because they are right. He nodded. She said, my daughter thinks a great deal of you. Then carefully, she does not trust many people. She comes by it honestly. There was something in the way she said that last sentence, a precision that suggested it was about more than Sadie. He waited, but Marlo only looked out the window at the December street and said nothing further. And he understood somehow that there were parts of this woman that moved at their own pace and would not be hurried, and that the patience required to wait for them was its own kind of respect. They finished their coffee. She stood to leave. At the door, she paused. Vera told me you have not made a decision yet about the Pruitts. No, she nodded. Take your time, but do not let taking your time become a way of not deciding. She looked at him steadily. You have earned the right to pursue this. After she left, he stood at the window for a long time watching the street. That same week, Sadie came to his apartment on a Wednesday afternoon with her history notes spread across his kitchen table and something else beneath the surface of her usual directness, a quality of hello breath, like a person carrying something they have been carrying for too long and are deciding whether to set it down. He did not ask. He made tea because there was tea in the cabinet now, which was still a fact that surprised him when he opened the cabinet and saw it, and they worked through her notes for an hour before the held breath quality became something she apparently could not contain any longer. She said, can I tell you something? He said, yes. She looked at her hands on the table. The night my dad died. She stopped, started again. We had a fight before he left. A stupid fight about nothing, about a curfew, about whether I could go to a concert with my friends. She paused. He left in the middle of it, got in his truck and drove away while I was still angry. She looked up at Beckett and then he did not come home. Beckett held very still. I have never told anyone that, she said, not even Mom. She thinks that night was fine, that we were fine, that it was just an accident. She does not know that the last thing I said to him was that he did not understand anything, and I wished he would just leave. Her voice was completely flat by the end of that sentence, the flatness of someone who has repeated a thing so many times in their own head that the emotion has been worn down to the bone of it. Beckett did not say that it was not her fault. He did not say that accidents were not caused by arguments, or that her father had loved her, or any of the things that were true and would have meant nothing in that moment. He had been on the receiving end of those sentences enough times to know what they felt like from the inside, like being handed something that does not fit the shape of what you are holding. He sat beside her instead. He did not move his chair closer or make any gesture that required her to acknowledge it. He simply sat beside her at the kitchen table in the small apartment on Fairlane Street in the December afternoon and let the silence be what it was. And after a while, Sadie's shoulders dropped from the position they had been holding for what looked like 3 years, and she breathed out slowly and did not say anything else, and that was enough. In the hallway outside his apartment door, Marlo stood with her hand against the wall. She had come to tell Sadie that dinner was 20 minutes away. She had stopped when she heard her daughter's voice through the door. Not the words at first, just the quality of it. Something stripped down and raw that she had not heard from Sadie in 3 years, maybe longer. A sound so unguarded it stopped her feet before she had thought to stop them. She had stood there and listened, and the words had arrived one by one like stones dropping into still water. The last thing I said to him was that I wished he would just leave. Marlo put her hand against the wall. She had been so careful in the years since Rex died to keep the machinery running. The club, the finances, Sadie's school, Sadie's meals, Sadie's appointments. She had told herself that keeping the machinery running was the same as keeping her daughter safe. She had told herself that Sadie was resilient, that Sadie was strong, that Sadie would find her way through it the same way Marlo had found her way through it, by not stopping, by not looking directly at the thing, by keeping moving until the moving itself became a kind of answer. She had not asked what Sadie was finding her way through. She had not known to ask, and that was the part that was reaching her now in the hallway, the part that went deeper than grief she had not known, because she had not been still enough to notice. She had looked at her daughter every day for 3 years and had seen the surface of her, the grades, the attitude, the quick humor, that was so much like Rex's. It sometimes stopped Marlowe mid-sentence and had told herself that what she saw was fine. Had needed it to be fine because if it was not fine, then she had been failing at the only thing that mattered more than keeping the club together. She stood in the hallway and listened to a 17-year-old boy she had known for 6 weeks say nothing at all, and she understood that the nothing was exactly right and that she had not known how to give her daughter that particular quality of nothing, and that her daughter had needed to find it somewhere outside of her. When she finally walked away from the door, she went down the stairs and out to the parking area behind the building where her motorcycle sat under the security light. She did not ride. She sat on the cold ground with her back against the rear tire and stayed there for a long time in the dark looking at the winter sky above the roofline. She did not cry. She was not ready for that yet. She had not been ready for 3 years, and she was not sure readiness was something you arrived at so much as something that arrived in you when it had decided you could hold it. But she stayed. She stayed until the cold came up through the pavement into her jeans, and she could hear the faint sound of voices from Beckett's window 3 floors above. Ordinary and calm, her daughter's voice among them, and she pressed her hand flat against the cold ground and let herself feel the full weight of everything she had been carrying and everything she had missed and everything that was even now finding its way back. The club meeting that December was held in the Iron Covenant Clubhouse, a converted textile warehouse on the south edge of Ridgefield that had been club property for 20 years. Beckett was not a member. He had not been invited as a member. He had been invited as what Harlan called, without ceremony, a friend of this house. He arrived on a Friday night to find the building lit from within, warm with light and noise, and stood outside for a moment before going in. The inside was everything the outside was not. Enormous, full, chaotic, in the best sense, people at every table, voices and laughter, and the smell of food and beer and engine oil, a band playing something loud and country in the back corner. Kids ran between the parked bikes in the interior space. Couples danced. A group of older members sat at a long table near the bar, with the settled authority of people who had been in their chairs for a long time. Harlan waved him to that table. Beckett sat between Harlan and Vera Dunn and ate more food than he had eaten at any single sitting, in recent memory pulled pork and cornbread in a sweet potato dish, that one of the older members, a woman named Grace who had arms like a longshoreman and a laugh you could hear from outside the building, said was her grandmother's recipe and not to be questioned. Near the end of the evening, Harlan leaned toward him with the unhurried gravity that seemed to be the man's natural register. "Something you should know," he said, "not to alarm you, but to inform you." Beckett set down his fork. "Dex Morrow, you may have seen him tonight. Big man Gray sits at the far end." Harlan paused. "Dex has raised some concerns about the situation. About you specifically." Beckett kept his expression neutral. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind," Harlan said carefully, "that come from personal history more than present facts." He was quiet for a moment. 15 years ago, Dex took in a kid. Rough situation, not unlike yours. Gave him a home, brought him into the club family. That kid eventually took money from the club and disappeared. Beckett absorbed this. "I am telling you this." Harlan continued, "Not because I agree with Dex's position. I do not. I am telling you because you should understand why some people in this room are watching more carefully than others. And because understanding it is better than not understanding it." "Is he going to be a problem?" Beckett asked. Harlan considered. "He is going to be a complicated presence," he said. "That is different from a problem." He picked up his beer. "The complicated presences are usually the ones worth understanding." From across the room, Beckett found the man Harlan had indicated, Dex Morrow, somewhere in his 50s, broad and gray-haired, with a face that had been organized by years of weather and experience into something that did not give much away. He sat apart from the main energy of the room, not sullen exactly, but separate, watching. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Dex looked at him with an expression Beckett could not fully read. Not hostility, not exactly. Something more like the face of someone who has been hurt in a specific way and is looking at the specific shape of the thing that hurt them. Beckett looked away first. Warren Fisk called on a Wednesday morning while Beckett was at the library between classes. "I have filed the paperwork on the Pruitt claim," Warren said. "State Fraud Division has been notified. County Social Service has opened an internal review." He paused. The Pruitts have retained an attorney. Beckett stepped outside the library into the cold December air. Okay, their attorney has been in contact with a reporter at the Ridgefield Courier. Warren's voice was careful and precise. The story that is apparently being developed characterizes the situation as, and I am quoting, a vulnerable minor being brought into the orbit of an outlaw motorcycle club. Beckett stood in the cold. The words arranged themselves in his mind with a terrible clarity. He could see the headline. He could see the photograph. They would use something from the bridge, maybe, or the apartment building, something that could be made to look like two different things depending on what the caption said. Warren continued, "The reporter has reached out to Ridgefield High for comment. Your principal, Dr. Ellison, called me this morning." "What did he say?" "He is," Warren said, concerned. "He is also, in my assessment, primarily concerned about the school's public perception rather than your well-being." He paused. "That distinction is important." "Can they stop it?" Beckett asked. "The story," Warren said. "No, the story will run. What we can control is the context." He paused. "Harlan is aware. Marlowe is aware. The club is going to respond. But I want you to be prepared because when this story runs, your life at that school is going to become complicated." He thanked Warren and put the phone in his pocket and stood in the cold for a moment. Then he went back inside the library and finished his shift tutoring Marcus with his algebra. The story ran on a Friday. He saw it first on a phone screen, someone's phone held at a particular angle in the hallway between second and third period, tilted just enough to be deliberate rather than accidental. The headline was, "Local Teen Taken In by Motorcycle Club Community Raises Concerns." The photograph was of the Iron Covenant Clubhouse. It had been taken at night, and whoever had chosen it carefully. The darkness, the motorcycles lined up outside, the light spilling from the interior, made it look like something from a crime procedural. The story was not technically inaccurate. It mentioned the rescue. It mentioned the apartment, the job, the legal support. But the language around each fact tilted slightly in one direction, a sustained lean that turned a story about generosity into a story about questions. Community members wonder. Local officials have expressed concern. The club, which has been the subject of past investigations, and here a reference to a 7-year-old case that had resulted in no charges, declined to comment. By third period, the hallway temperature had changed, not dramatically, not in any way he could not have explained away individually. But the sum of the small things, a pulled-away shoulder here, a look, held 1 second longer than necessary there, a conversation that stopped when he walked by, added up to something he recognized. He had lived in environments that required him to read the room continuously, and this room was telling him something. After school, Dr. Ellison called him into the office. The principal was a man in his late 50s who wore his authority like a garment he had never been entirely comfortable in. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded and spoke in the careful, measured cadences of someone who had rehearsed. He said he wanted to check in. He said the school's priority was Beckett's well-being. He said there were resources available. He said the counseling office had an open door. He said all of these things without once looking directly at Beckett's face, and Beckett sat in the chair across from him and understood with complete clarity that this meeting was not about his well-being at all. It was about the school's relationship with the story that was now running in the Ridgefield Courier. He thanked Dr. Ellison and left. He was 3 blocks from school, walking home in the cold December dusk when he turned onto Fairlane Street and saw the light was wrong in his building's entrance. The exterior door, which required a key, was standing open 3 inches. He stopped on the sidewalk. He stood there for 15 seconds, running the calculation. Then he went inside. The stairwell was quiet, 3rd floor quiet. The door to 304 was closed, but when he reached it, he saw that the lock had been forced. The frame splintered at the strike plate, the door sitting fractionally out of true in its frame. He pushed it open. The apartment had been gone through methodically. Not destroyed, nothing broken, nothing overturned in rage. Methodical, drawers opened and left open. The closet searched his clothes on the floor rather than on their hangers. His notebooks on the table had been moved and replaced imprecisely, the edges not aligned. His chemistry book had been opened and left face down, spine stressed. On the wall above the table in red spray painting, "You do not belong here." Beckett stood in the doorway and looked at the room. He was aware of his breathing, aware of the particular quality of the silence in the apartment, the way it felt different from the ordinary silence of an empty room. Someone had been here. Someone had stood in his space and moved through it and decided to leave a message. He noticed then on the table beneath the misplaced chemistry book an envelope, plain white unsealed. He crossed the room and picked it up without touching anything else. Inside was a photograph. Not recent. The photograph showed the underpass at Route 9, the blue tarp visible between the concrete pillars, and in the frame of the tarp, small in the distance, barely more than a shape, a person in a sleeping bag. The timestamp on the photograph's edge read March 14th, 8 months ago, 2 months after he had begun living under that bridge. Someone had been at that underpass and taken this photograph and kept it. Kept it through the summer and the fall, and through the rescue and through everything that followed. Someone had been watching him before any of this began. Beckett set the photograph on the table and stood very still in his ruined apartment, with the red words above him, and felt something shift in his chest, not fear or not only fear, but something that had lived underneath the fear all along, something cold and purposeful that he recognized as his own resolve. He picked up his phone and called Marlo. She answered on the second ring. He said, "Something has happened. I need to tell you what I found." Her voice when she answered was completely steady. "Tell me everything." Marlo arrived in 11 minutes. Beckett knew because he had been standing at the window watching the street, and he counted the minutes the way he had learned to count things, not from anxiety, but from the habit of precision that had kept him functional for the better part of a year. 11 minutes from his call to the sound of her motorcycle on Fairlane Street, and then 4 minutes more before her knock at the door, which meant she had stopped somewhere on the way up, and he would find out why shortly. She came in with Vera Dunn behind her. Vera moved directly to the wall and looked at the red letters with her hands clasped behind her back and an expression of controlled assessment. Marlo moved through the apartment, slowly touching nothing, looking at everything. She paused at the table, looked at the photograph without picking it up. "March," she said. "Yes." She straightened and looked at him. "You have been here since November. Before that, you were under the bridge from February to November." She paused. "This photograph was taken in March. Someone knew where you were sleeping for months before Sadie fell off that bridge." Beckett nodded. He had been turning this over since he had found the envelope. He knew what it meant, and he knew what it did not mean, and he was trying to hold both things clearly without letting the worst interpretation run ahead of the evidence. Vera said without turning from the wall, "It is the Pruitts." Marlo looked at her. Vera turned. "Not all of them. The parents are in Ohio, and they are not the type. I have read the case file. They are negligent, not malicious." She paused. "But there is a son, Neil Pruitt, 24 years old. He has been in Ridgefield for at least 8 months, possibly longer. I found a rental address 2 weeks ago when I was completing the background work for Warren's filing. I did not think it was relevant at the time." Marlo was quiet for a moment. Why would he be watching Beckett? Because he knew what his family did, Vera said, and he knew that eventually someone might start asking questions. A kid on the street who was supposed to be in Ohio, if that ever came to anyone's attention, the whole thing unravels. The payments, the false filing, all of it. She looked at Beckett. "I do not think he was planning to do anything. I think he was watching because watching felt safer than not watching." "And then the story ran," Marlo said. "And then the story ran. And the attorney the Pruitts hired from Ohio called Neil and said things were accelerating, and Neil panicked. He went to the apartment looking for anything that could be used, letters, documents, evidence." Vera's voice remained even. He was not thinking clearly. When you cannot fix a thing, sometimes doing something feels like fixing it even when it is not. Beckett stood with this for a moment. He thought about someone standing at the edge of the Route 9 underpass in March in the cold, taking a photograph of a shape in a sleeping bag between concrete pillars. He tried to construct the psychology of it, the fear that would make a person do that, the particular quality of guilt that expresses itself as surveillance. He had known people like that, people who could not look away from the things they had done wrong. He said he is not dangerous. It was not a question. He was reading what Vera had laid out and arriving at the same place. Vera said, "In my assessment, no. He is 24 years old and he has been carrying knowledge of what his family did for 8 months, and it has been eating him." Marlo said, "That does not excuse what happened to this apartment." "No," Vera agreed. "It does not." The three of them stood in the small studio with the red letters on the wall and the scattered evidence of a search conducted by someone frightened rather than hostile, and Beckett felt the situation arranging itself with a clarity he recognized. He had learned to read situations, had developed that skill out of necessity, the ability to see not just what was happening, but what was underneath it, what the thing was actually about. This was about a frightened 24-year-old who had spent 8 months watching a problem get larger and had not known what to do. He knew something about that. He said, "Let me talk to him." Marlo looked at him steadily. "No, I am not asking you to send me alone." He met her eyes. "I am asking you not to send the club." She held his gaze for a long moment. The quality of her assessment was something he had grown accustomed to over the past weeks, the way she looked at a thing from several angles before she committed to a position. The refusal to rush. She said, "You want to understand him." Beckett said, "I want to give him a choice." Marlo was quiet. "Then I will come with you." "Not the club, just me." He nodded. Vera said she would reach Warren and have him prepare the relevant documents. She said this with the calm of someone noting an item on a list, which was Beckett had come to understand exactly how Vera Dunn processed most things, not from coldness, but from the long practice of remaining functional in circumstances that required it. They left the apartment and went to find Neil Pruitt. The address Vera had found was a rental house on the east side of Ridgefield, in a neighborhood of narrow lots and aluminum-sided houses that had been built for mill workers in the 1950s and had been absorbing the wear of subsequent decades without complaint. The house was a gray Cape Cod with a rusted metal awning over the front door and a truck in the driveway that looked like it had been recently driven. Marlo parked her motorcycle at the curb and sat for a moment before she dismounted, doing the same kind of assessment she always did. Then she got off the bike and stood beside Beckett on the sidewalk. He rang the bell. The man who opened the door was younger than Beckett had expected, despite knowing his age. Neil Pruitt was 24, but he looked younger, the kind of young that comes not from good fortune, but from the unfinished quality of someone who has not yet had to fully account for himself. He was medium height and thin, with light eyes and light hair, and when he opened the door and saw who was standing on his front step, the color drained from his face with a completeness that was almost clinical. He looked at Beckett, then at Marlo, then back at Beckett. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. They sat in a small living room that was sparse in the way of someone who had not committed to being in a place. A couch, a table, a television, the minimum arrangement of a person who had not decided whether to stay. Beckett sat across from Neil Pruitt and looked at him with an attention that was not hostile. He was trying to see clearly. Neil's hands were folded on his knees and he was looking at the floor. "You were in Ridgefield before the rescue," Beckett said. A pause. Then, "Yes." "You knew where I was sleeping." Another pause longer. "Yes." Neil looked up then, and what Beckett saw in his face was not the expression of someone who had intended harm. It was the expression of someone who had been inside a terrible situation for so long that they could not find the edges of it anymore. "I did not," he started. His voice was rough. "I was not planning anything. I just needed to know where you were. In case what Marlo said." Her voice was even. "In case Neil looked at Beckett. In case you went to someone, a teacher, a counselor, anyone. My dad kept saying it would be fine, that no one would notice that you were just a kid in the system, and kids in the system fell through cracks all the time." He stopped. The word cracks sat in the room for a moment with all its weight. "And you did not agree with your father," Beckett said. Neil's jaw tightened. "I knew what they did was wrong from the beginning, but I did not stop them. I just watched. I told myself it would be okay, that you would end up in a shelter or another placement, that the system would catch you." He looked up, and the expression on his face now was something Beckett recognized. The look of someone examining the specific shape of their own failure. "I told myself that for 8 months. The apartment," Marlo said. Neil closed his eyes briefly. The attorney called, said things were moving faster than expected. He said there might be records, letters, documents, anything that could be used. "I know I know you did not have anything like that. I was not thinking clearly. I needed to do something." He shook his head slowly. "When you cannot fix a thing, sometimes doing something feels like fixing it even when it is not." Beckett sat with this for a moment. He thought about the boy in the sleeping bag in the March photograph. He thought about what it meant to know that you were being watched without knowing it, not the specific menace of it, but the longer, stranger implication that someone had known he was there, had known his situation, and had made the choice every day for 8 months to keep watching rather than act. He thought about what Vera had said. He has been carrying knowledge of what his family did for 8 months, and it has been eating him. He looked at Neil Pruitt and said, I am not asking you to testify against your family. Neil looked up sharply, but I am asking you to tell the truth. Beckett kept his voice steady. Not for me. For the record that exists about what happened. So that the record is accurate. Neil was silent. Marlowe said quietly, You already know what you have to do. That is why you have been eating yourself alive for 8 months. You know. Neil Pruitt looked at the woman sitting across from him, the vice president of 200 motorcycle club members, who had every material reason to handle this situation very differently than she was handling it, and something in his face shifted. Something resolved. He said, I will call the State Fraud Division myself, before Warren Fisk does. Marlowe nodded once. He said, I want to write a statement for the paper to correct what their attorney put out. Beckett said, You do not have to do that. Neil said, Yes, I do. He said it the way someone says something that has been true for a while and has finally been said out loud. It had the quality of a door opening. They left him with Vera's number and Warren's card and the particular quiet of a room where something has been decided. On the sidewalk outside, Marlowe stood beside her motorcycle and looked at the house for a moment. Then she looked at Beckett. That she said was not what I expected. What did you expect? She considered. More and less. She put on her helmet. Come on, I will buy you dinner. She paused. It is not a reward. I just think you need to eat. He got on behind her motorcycle. He had never ridden one before. She told him to hold the hand grips on either side of the seat and not to lean against the turns, but with them. And they rode through the December streets of Ridgefield, with the cold moving past them and the city lights beginning to come up through the early dark. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Beckett Calloway was not thinking about the next problem. He was only inside the present moment, moving through it. It was enough. Neil Pruitt's statement ran in the Ridgefield Courier 6 days later. It was not a long statement. It did not contain self-justification or elaborate context. It was in the way of confessions made by people who have thought carefully about what they owe, simply accurate. It named what the Pruitt family had done. It named what Beckett had been living through while they did it. It corrected the characterization of Iron Covenant as a predatory presence and described in plain language what had actually happened at the Route 9 bridge, 200 people showing up to honor a debt. The State Fraud Division had been in contact with Warren Fisk 3 days before the statement ran. The Pruitt's attorney in Ohio had, according to Warren's carefully worded update, substantially changed their position. The follow-up story in the Courier ran under a different reporter's byline. Its headline read, The Real Story Behind the Rescue. Dr. Ellison called Beckett into his office again. This meeting was different from the first. The principal sat behind his desk with the same folded hands, but a different quality of attention, less rehearsed, more present. He said that he wanted to apologize for his initial response, that he recognized in retrospect that he had been more concerned with the school's reputation than with the facts of the situation. He said this without obvious comfort, in a way that suggested it was costing him something which Beckett appreciated more than a smoother delivery would have. He accepted the apology, not because it resolved everything, but because it was genuine, and he had learned in the months of this strange new life that genuine things deserved to be received as what they were. The Iron Covenant held an emergency chapter meeting the night Neil Pruitt's statement ran. Beckett was not present for the first part of that meeting. He was told about it afterward by Colt. In the straightforward way, Colt delivered most information without embellishment chronologically, with appropriate weight given to the important parts. Dex Morrow had stood up at the beginning of the meeting before anyone else spoke and addressed the room. He had talked for 12 minutes. Colt could not remember the exact words, but the substance was this: Dex had been wrong. Not about his reasons. His reasons came from a real place, from the real loss of something he had invested himself in and had taken from him. But he had been wrong to let that loss determine his position on a different situation, a different person. He had been wrong to make Beckett carry the weight of a betrayal that had nothing to do with Beckett. And then Dex had said, I told myself I was protecting the club, but I was protecting myself from having to try again. And that is not the same thing. The room had been very still. Harlan had then, without ceremony, opened the floor to a vote on whether the situation with Beckett, the apartment, the legal support, all of it would continue as a formal commitment of the chapter. The vote was unanimous, including Dex. When Colt finished telling him this, Beckett sat with it for a moment. He thought about Dex Morrow, whom he had never spoken to directly. The man who had sat apart at the holiday party with an expression that Beckett had read as hostility, but which he now understood differently as the look of someone in pain, who had organized that pain as opposition, because opposition is easier to maintain than grief. He asked Colt, "Can I talk to him, Dex?" "Yes." Colt looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I think you can." He found Dex Morrow in the club garage the following Saturday morning. The garage was a large space off the main clubhouse where members worked on bikes, and Dex was there alone, bent over a disassembled engine on a workbench, his hands dark with grease and his attention wholly absorbed. He looked up when Beckett came in, and his expression went through several things quickly before it settled. Beckett said, "I heard what you said at the meeting." Dex straightened, looked at him. "I wanted to say," Beckett paused, choosing the words with care, "I am sorry about the kid. From 15 years ago, I do not know his name or what happened exactly. But I am sorry it went the way it did." He held Dex's gaze. "And I am sorry you had to carry that." Dex was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "His name was Tommy." He said it like someone saying a name they had not said out loud in a while. "Tommy Greer. He was 16. Not so different from you." Beckett nodded. Dex set down the wrench he had been holding. He looked at his hands for a moment, then looked up. "I was not wrong that it happens," he said. "That kids in bad situations sometimes make bad choices." "No," Beckett said. "You are not wrong about that. But you are not Tommy." "No." Dex looked at him with an expression that was, Beckett thought, one of the more honest he had seen on an adult's face in recent memory. It was the expression of someone who had decided to see clearly rather than safely. He said, "Marlo was right about you. She usually is." There was something in the way he said Marlo's name, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent. The particular tone of long respect. Beckett said, "She is not easy to understand." Dex almost smiled. "No, she is not." He picked up the wrench again, turned it in his hands. Rex was the same way. Meant everything he did not always explain why. He paused. "She has been keeping this whole thing together since he died, and most people do not know half of what that cost her." Beckett was quiet. Dex looked at him. "She chose you," he said. "The same way she chooses everything she chooses because she saw something and she decided." He went back to the engine. "Do not waste it." Warren won the civil claim in February. The settlement was not large, the Pruitt's assets were limited, and the state fraud case had absorbed most of the legal energy, but it was enough. Combined with the back support payments the state had recalculated and issued, Beckett had, for the first time in his life, money that belonged to him that he had not earned in the ordinary sense, but that was his by right. He put half of it in savings. He told Warren to put the other half toward the legal costs, since Warren had not billed him for a single hour of work, and this was the nearest approximation of repayment he could offer with any dignity. Warren accepted it with the same directness he applied to everything, and they shook hands across the desk, and that was that. The University of Virginia application had gone in November, when Vera had sat with him at the kitchen table and gone through it line by line with the same methodical attention she had brought to everything else. The scholarship application had followed in December. The essay he had written himself in 2 drafts at the table by the window in the apartment on Fairlane Street. He had not shown it to anyone before he sent it. The essay was about structure, about how structure is survival, about a man named Harold who had lived under a bridge and taught him the most important thing he knew, about what it meant to maintain a life by force of precision when everything around it was imprecise. He had written it without sentimentality in the same clear specific prose he used in his chemistry notes, and he had sent it before he could decide whether it was too much or not enough. The letter arrived in March. He read it twice standing at the mailbox in the lobby of the Fairlane Street building, then once more sitting on the stairs. Full scholarship, academic merit, housing and living stipend included, enrollment in the fall. He sat on the stairs for a while. Then he called Vera because Vera would know what steps needed to happen next and would tell him without ceremony which was what he needed. She answered on the first ring. He told her. She was quiet for 3 seconds and then said, "Good. Now get a pen." He called Marlo second. She answered on the second ring the way she always did. He told her. She was quiet for a different kind of 3 seconds, the kind that is not processing information but is something else, something interior. Then she said in a voice that was very level, Rex would have wanted to know that. He would have been loud about it. He said, "You are not going to be loud about it." She said no. But he could hear in the careful evenness of her voice something that was not trying to be contained and was not entirely succeeding. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Do not." He said, "Marlo," a pause. He said, "Thank you." She said very quietly, "You are welcome, Beckett." In the weeks that followed, something shifted between Marlo and Sadie in the way that things shift when they have been ready to shift for a long time and are only waiting for the right pressure. Beckett was not present for most of it and did not need to be. He saw the evidence of it in the small things, the way Sadie mentioned her mother, without the careful neutrality she had always used before, the way Marlo's hand rested briefly on Sadie's shoulder one afternoon, when they were all three at his kitchen table, and neither of them seemed to notice it as a significant thing, which meant it had stopped being significant and had simply become ordinary. He thought about that for days afterward. The tremendous labor required to make a thing ordinary again. He had gone to the Voss house on a Sunday afternoon in March, ostensibly to return a book Sadie had lent him, and found the two of them in the kitchen together without any particular distance between them. Not dramatically close, not performing closeness, just occupying the same space without the invisible wall he had noticed before. Marlo was reading something at the counter. Sadie was at the table with her homework. When Beckett came in, Sadie straightened the collar of Marlo's jacket without looking up from her work. The gesture so casual it was clearly not the first time, and Marlo went very still for 1 second before continuing to read. And that single second was one of the most complete things Beckett had ever witnessed. He stayed for 2 hours and left feeling that he had been privileged to see something. The graduation ceremony for Ridgefield High's senior class was held on the second Saturday in June in the school gymnasium, which had been arranged with folding chairs and paper streamers in a podium at one end that looked modest for the weight of occasion it was being asked to carry. Beckett arrived early to line up with his class and stood in the staging hallway in his cap and gown, which fit imperfectly across the shoulders in a way that would have bothered him once and did not bother him now. Around him, his classmates were doing the things that people do in the minutes before ceremonies, adjusting gowns, checking phones, locating their families in the bleachers with the particular scanning anxiety of people about to perform something in public. He did not scan the bleachers. He already knew what he would find there. When the processional began and the graduating class walked in 2 columns through the gymnasium doors, the sound hit him before he could see the source. Not applause exactly, or rather not only applause, a sound that was part applause and part something lower, a rhythmic noise he placed after one beat as boot heels on metal bleachers. He looked toward the sound. The entire first section of bleachers on the left side of the gymnasium had been claimed. Every seat in that section held a person in a black leather vest. They sat in rows with the same organized stillness as the morning under the bridge. And when Beckett's column came through the doors, the section produced the boot heel sound collectively, a rolling thunder of deliberate welcome that drew looks from every other family in the gymnasium and did not, as far as Beckett could tell, concern any of them in the least. He found Marlo without difficulty. She was in the second row, which meant she had let Harlan and some of the senior members have the front row. That restraint was so characteristic of her that it felt like a signature. She was wearing the leather vest over a dark blue shirt, and her hair was down, and she was sitting with her spine straight and her hands in her lap, and she was watching the processional with an expression Beckett could see from 40 feet away. Beside her was Sadie in a green dress, her hair loose, not braided. She was sitting close to her mother, close in the way people sit when the distance between them has been deliberately reduced, when the closing of that distance has been chosen, and the choice is still recent enough to be visible. Marlo's hand rested on the bench between them. Sadie's was beside it, not quite touching, but close enough that the not quite was its own kind of language. He thought about the hallway outside his apartment door. He thought about Marlo sitting on cold pavement behind the building in the December dark, her hand flat against the ground. He thought about what it cost a person to stay still long enough for the things they had been running from to catch up and become finally something they could hold. He reached his seat in the folding chairs. The ceremony proceeded in the way of ceremonies, speeches, acknowledgments, the patient architecture of a ritual that existed to mark a threshold. The principal spoke about futures. A student speaker spoke about resilience. A teacher he did not know spoke about possibility. When they called his name, he stood and walked to the podium. He received the diploma from the hand of Dr. Ellison, who met his eyes and nodded with a gravity that acknowledged something between them that had been repaired but not entirely forgotten, and Beckett nodded back with the same gravity. Then he turned and faced the gymnasium. From the first section of bleachers on the left, the rolling thunder of boot heels on metal rose again louder, this time sustained, until it had the character not of noise, but of language. He stood at the podium with his diploma and let it reach him and did not try to manage his expression. He found Marlo in the second row. She was watching him with an expression he had been trying to read since the riverbank, the one that was not pity and not pride exactly, but something that encompassed both without being reducible to either. Something that looked like a person who has seen a thing that confirms what they believed, but were not certain of until now. He nodded at her. She nodded back. Beside her, Sadie was on her feet, clapping with both hands raised, grinning with an unself-consciousness that had been arriving in increments since the day they met. Each time she smiled, it came slightly more easily than the time before. He thought she looked in this moment like a 14-year-old who had put something heavy down and was only now beginning to notice the difference in her own hands. In the back row of the leather vest section, Dex Morrow, arms crossed expression, as weathered and contained as ever was on his feet. The last Saturday of July was warm and blue. Beckett had spent the morning loading his things into a duffel bag and a single cardboard box, different from the cardboard box under the bridge, a new one purchased for this purpose. It held different things now: textbooks, the University of Virginia, welcome packet, his notebooks, the photograph from the drawer of the bedside table. He looked at it before he put it in. A woman and a small boy in front of a house with a very blue sky. He placed it carefully in the box, face up this time, and closed the flaps. Marlo knocked at 9. She came in and looked at the packed apartment with a brief, thorough assessment, and then looked at him. She was wearing jeans and the leather vest, and her hair was down, and he noticed Rex's watch on her left wrist. She wore it sometimes, he had learned, on days that required something from her. She said, "Ready." He said, "Almost." She sat at the table while he finished packing. She did not offer to help, and he did not ask, because they had both, over the course of these months, developed an understanding of what the other person needed, which in this case was for him to complete this task himself. He appreciated it more than he could have explained. When the box was sealed and the duffel was zipped, he stood in the middle of the empty apartment and looked at it. The table by the window, the radiator, the clawfoot tub visible through the bathroom door, the stretch of hardwood floor between the door and the window, where on winter mornings the low sun had made a rectangle of light that he had sometimes stood in just to feel it. He had lived here for 8 months. He had learned in this space that warmth was not a luxury, that the days themselves were the thing, not the circumstances around them, that accepting help was not the same as surrendering the self, that the people who had given him this space had given him not only shelter, but time, the time to become at a pace that was his own, whatever he was going to be. Marlo was standing in the doorway. She held something out to him. It was a leather band, worn dark with a small metal buckle. Simple. The kind of thing that had been worn for a long time by someone who wore things because they meant something, rather than because they looked like they meant something. Rex always wore this, she said. She was not looking at him, but at the band in her outstretched hand. He had it since before the club. Before any of this. She paused. He used to say the bravest person in the room is not the one who is not afraid. It is the one who is afraid and jumps anyway. Beckett took the band. He looked at it for a moment. The leather was smooth with long use, the surface holding the impression of someone's wrist. Someone he had never met but felt in some way he could not fully articulate that he understood. He put it on. Marlo finally looked at him, and he saw something cross her face, quick and genuine and entirely unguarded, that was gone before he could fully see it. But he had seen it. He stored it. She said in a voice that was completely level, "He would have liked you." Beckett said, "I would have liked to know him." She nodded once, picked up the box from the table without being asked. He picked up the duffel. They went down the stairs together, out through the lobby onto the Fairlane Street sidewalk in the warm July morning. Colt's truck was at the curb, Colt himself leaning against the door with a coffee in each hand, the uncomplicated grin of someone who had no apparent ambivalence about this or any other moment. He handed Beckett a coffee without ceremony. "Ready, ready." They loaded the box in the duffel. Colt got in. The engine turned over. Marlowe stood on the sidewalk. Beckett stood at the open passenger door and looked at her. He was aware of the distance to Charlottesville 2 hours south. He was aware of the orientation of the day, the way the summer light fell on the buildings on Fairlane Street. He was aware of every small detail in the way that details present themselves when something is ending in order to become something else. He said, "I will call." She said, "I know you will." He said, "Tell Sadie I will text her the chemistry tutor's number. She has that placement test in September." Marlowe said she already has it. "She asked me to ask you 2 weeks ago, and I told her to ask you herself." He almost smiled. "Did she?" "She will." Marlowe looked at him steadily. "She is getting there." He got into the truck. Colt pulled away from the curb. At the first intersection, Beckett looked in the passenger mirror. Marlowe was still on the sidewalk exactly where he had left her, not watching the truck, but looking down the street in the other direction towards something he could not see from here. Already thinking about the next thing. Already moving internally toward whatever came after this moment. That was so completely her that it made something settle in his chest. He turned back to the road ahead. It was 200 miles to Charlottesville, and a different life waiting there. And the morning was clear and warm, and the road unfolded through Virginia hills that were turning at their edges the first faint green of something new beginning. Beckett Calloway rode south with Rex's leather band on his wrist and the photograph in the box behind him, in 8 months of impossible grace in his bones, and he did not look back. Not because he wanted to forget, because for the first time in his life, he did not need to. The road ahead was wide open, and he knew now how to drive toward it.